Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining me for today's Bible study in our Revelation and End Times series. This is a study of prophecy in the end times, and today we are looking at Daniel chapter 10 through 12. It's a continuation of where we've been the last couple of weeks talking about Daniel chapter 10 through 12. And so, just to give you a quick reminder, in the book of Daniel, where we are at, Daniel had been given 5 different visions. And, well, he'd really been given 4 visions, but a 5th one he was a part of. Let's recap those visions quickly. So the visions that Daniel had been given, first of all, he was given a vision, or he participated in a vision, we'll put it that way, in chapter 2. Now, this vision that was given to King Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel was a part of was a prophecy about a statue. And if you remember in Daniel chapter 2, the statue was that of having 5 different parts. First, it had a head of gold, it had a breast and arms of silver, it had a belly and thighs of bronze. It had legs of iron, and then it had feet that were partly iron and partly clay. And what those were 5 different kingdoms that would arise. And the kingdoms would be over the same region in the same area that Babylon's kingdom was in, that King Nebuchadnezzar ruled over. So it would have to be in the Middle Eastern area. It would have to be a Middle Eastern empire. And so what empires fit that bill? Well, those are going to be the Babylonian Empire, it would be the Medo-Persian Empire, it would be the Greek Empire, it would be the Ottoman Empire, and then the final one would be a revived Ottoman Empire. That would be the feet of iron and clay. And that was the chapter 2 vision that Daniel had, and it was a vision that King Nebuchadnezzar had, that Daniel was able to interpret that vision. And then you have these other 4 visions that were Daniel was given directly, and these were all standalone visions, but they all were intertwined because every one of them is going to really connect to the other one. And so here's what you had. You had chapter 7, and in chapter 7 it's where Daniel had a vision, and this time the vision that Daniel had was a vision of 4 beasts, and these 4 beasts were rising out of the waters. You had the first beast, again, these would have represented kingdoms and empires. The first beast would have been the kingdom and the empire of Babylon. The second would have been the empire of the Medo-Persians. The third would have been the empire of the Greeks, the Greek Empire. And then the fourth would be the empire of the Ottomans. And out of the fourth, it was this dragon empire. It would be a revived empire because it would be a beast that would, in Revelation, it would be no more, and then it would come back again. It had multiple horns, and out of one of the sets of horns, or out in between the horns, there was a little horn that grew out, and it spoke blasphemous words. It grew out of basically nothingness, this little horn that grew into power, and that is the picture of the Antichrist. So you had the 4 kingdoms of the 4 beasts. The 4th kingdom would be the revived kingdom, and out of that comes the Antichrist empire. Then you had chapter 8, and this was the vision that Daniel had about the ram and the goat. The ram and the goat would have represented the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. So the second and third empires in the statue, the second and third beasts that come out of the sea in chapter 7. And this would have been, the ram would have been one that had 2 horns. The first horn grew up, and then the second horn grew up larger and later than the first horn did. That was the Medo-Persian Empire, and it faced this goat, and the goat was the Greek Empire, and the goat had a large horn that would have been Alexander the Great, and out of the large horn that was broken off, you had 4 horns that grew up into its place. Out of the one horn grew 4. And that is the 4 empires that would grow out of the empire of Alexander the Great, out of the Greek Empire. Those empires are going to be important to understand. The ram and the goat and the 4 empires that grew up after Alexander's death are important to understand, and it helps us to understand the end times events as well. Again, all of these are happening around the same region. These are all the same different areas that are that the Middle East is all encompassed with today. There's always been battle in the Middle East. There's always been battle around the Persian Empire area that Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8 are talking about. Then you have Daniel chapter 9. This was the third vision that Daniel had, the fourth one of all of the visions that are recorded in the book of Daniel. And chapter 9, the vision that Daniel saw was the vision of what is called the 70 weeks and the Messiah, the Meshiach. The Mashiach, the Messiah, comes after 69 weeks. And so Daniel gave this prophecy, or the prophecy was given to Daniel that Daniel then passed on, and it was when the Son of Man, or when the Messiah, was going to come. He would come in a total of 69 weeks. Now, 69 weeks from what? From the command to go and rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the wall, the command that was given to Nehemiah. After that command was given, the clock started, and it was 69 weeks. Now, we know that the 69 weeks is not, it was actually going to be a period of 7 weeks, a period of 62 weeks, and then it will be followed by another 7-week period down later. Now, these are the 69 weeks. It's not a week, it's what's called a heptad. The word heptad means groupings of 7, and what it meant was 70 groupings of 7. 70 groupings of 7 would be 70 groupings of 7 years, which is 490 years. So you had a period of time after the 69 heptads, the 69 weeks from the command to go rebuild the wall, is when the Messiah, the Mashiach, would come. And after Mashiach comes, after the Messiah comes, he will then be cut off for the sins of the people. After he is cut off, then the people of the prince who was to come, in other words, the people of the Antichrist that was to come, would come and destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple. That's what happened in 70 AD. Many think that it was the Roman Empire that destroyed it, but it was actually the mercenaries that were part of the army of the Roman Empire who defied the orders of the king, of the general. They defied the orders. These were Arab peoples that defied the orders to burn the temple down. The Roman Empire did not want the temple burned down, but they did. They set it on fire. So the Roman general Titus said, "Go scrape off all the gold off the stones, roll the stones into the valley, save everything that you possibly can." So he was very upset, but it was the people of the prince, the people of, again, the Middle Eastern Persian area of the prince that would come, of the Antichrist, who would come. So you have the period of 7 weeks, 62 weeks, then you have the final week. Daniel's final week is the final 7 years, and that is known as the final time of tribulation. It's not just a tribulation, it is the great tribulation. It is the final 7 weeks of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. And then you have Daniel's final prophecy that is given in Daniel chapter 10 through 12, and it's one prophecy that encompasses 3 different chapters. It's a longer prophecy, but this prophecy is specifically about the coming Antichrist and his kingdom, his empire. So this is specifically about what the Antichrist will be like, how the Antichrist will act, what the Antichrist will do in Daniel's final 7-week, or of the 70 weeks, the final week of the 70-week prophecy will be the coming of the Antichrist and actually what he will do. So it's a vision of the final tribulation. So what we're going to do is turn to Daniel chapter 10. I'm going to recap a couple of verses. We're going to skip through a bunch, getting ourselves all the way to Daniel chapter 11, verse 21, where that really picks up the emphasis of what the Antichrist will be. Prior to Daniel chapter 11, verse 21, it's more historical information, but picking it up in Daniel chapter 11, verse 21 becomes future events of what this Antichrist is actually going to be like and what we can learn about the Antichrist. So let's jump into this. Let's pick it up in Daniel chapter 10. So starting in Daniel chapter 10. Now let me just give you a quick rundown. Daniel chapter 10 through 12. Again, it's one vision. It's the vision of the final tribulation. Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, here's what it says. In the 3rd year of King Cyrus of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belshazzar. The oracle was true and concerns a great war. He understood the message and gained insight through a vision. So Daniel is saying this, that the vision is true. This is exactly what I saw. This is accurate. I have written down exactly what happened to me and exactly what I have gone through. And the vision, the oracle that was given, the vision that was given to me is something that concerns, he says, a great war. It concerns a great war. Other versions of the Bible, you may see it interpreted this way. It refers to or it concerns a great conflict, a great war, or a great conflict. Now, all of this is about the final time of tribulation. Throughout history, there has always been tribulation. Tribulation is not unique. It is nothing new. Jesus talked about the fact that in this world we will have trouble, we will have tribulation. In the book of Acts, there was something understood in the book of Acts that salvation really comes through times of tribulation. In other words, you can know where your salvation is as you undergo tribulation. It really brings forth what your heart really is all about. So times of tribulation are nothing new. Tribulation is all throughout the New Testament. It is talked about in every one of the books. There's talks of suffering and trials and hardships. The book of James says, count it all joy when you encounter various trials. The same word for trial is the word tribulation, the word trouble. All of those things are wrapped up into one. So there's always been tribulation. There's never been a time of history where there hasn't been tribulation. It is not unique. God's people have always gone times of suffering and times of trouble, and you will experience tribulation as a believer. We all will experience tribulation as believers. There's a difference between this one and the normal tribulation that we all go through that's been part of history and part of life. And the difference is that this one is called a great one. In Matthew 24, Jesus refers to this kind of tribulation. He says, this is the great tribulation. In Revelation 7, it says that this is the tribulation, the great one. So the difference in this event compared to all events of history is that this is unequaled in its severity. It is unequaled in the events that are going to happen. Tribulation, again, is normal throughout history, but this one is unique because of the unequaled severity and power and destruction that it will actually have. So this is a great war. This is the final war. This is the war to end all wars. This is the time of tribulation as such the world, Jesus says, has never seen, nor will it ever again. This one is the great war. So when Daniel receives this vision, he is given something concerning the great war. We know that this has to be the end times events because Jesus promises that this is going to be the case, that this will be a end times event like nothing that we have ever seen before. Then he goes on to say this. He goes on to say in chapter 10, verse 14, there's an angel that comes to Daniel. Now, the angel, what we have looked at is that this angel is a picture of what spiritual warfare is going to look like and what spiritual warfare is going to be about in the end times events. So here's what spiritual warfare is in the book of Daniel. There's an angel that comes to Daniel and he wants to bring the message to Daniel. Daniel starts praying and fasting. He does so for 21 days. But on day 1, according to chapter 10, the message got through to God. God sent an angel to speak to him. The angel was detained and involved in a conflict, and he was involved in a conflict with what was called the Prince of Persia. From this chapter, we get a picture of what spiritual warfare really is, and here's my explanation of it. People are going to disagree with this explanation, but I believe that it's very sound in the way that the Bible teaches it. That Satan is called the ruler of this world. So I want you to think of Satan as a commander. He is the commander of his forces and his troops. He is called the ruler of this world. So he has a say upon how the world is going to function and what the world is going to believe and do. Most of what we see in the world, most of the disobedience we see, the rebelliousness we see comes out of the fact that he is the ruler and he is directing what is happening. Satan is not God. And this is important to understand, that he does not have the same power and authority that God has. God is the creator, Satan is not the creator. God is King of kings, Satan is not King of kings. God is Lord of lords, he is not, Satan is not Lord of lords. God is omniscient, he is omnipotent, he is omnipresent, he is omnibenevolent, meaning he's always good, he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, he's ever-present. Satan does not have that ability. If you are attributing to Satan those kind of powers, you are understanding it incorrectly. Satan is a created being. He does not have the same power that God has. Therefore, when you are under spiritual attack, it is not Satan that is doing this. It is one of his troops, one of his forces. Now, what it says in the Bible and what we can understand is that he, as the commander, must have numbers under him that would be kind of like the generals. We are referenced in Daniel 10. We have the reference of the prince of Persia. Then he also references the prince of Greece as two of the powers of Satan, two of the generals that come underneath Satan. So if you think about that logically, that would mean that Satan has a prince over different regions of the world. That there are princes that are overseeing the regions of the world. There's probably a prince of the United States. Maybe there's multiple ones. I don't know. It doesn't indicate it, but you can logically assume by what is being said that Satan as the commander has generals that are princes that are underneath him, and they're over regions of the world. The prince of Persia is the area of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Afghanistan, stretching over to Pakistan, probably that general area that he is over. Under the prince of Persia's or prince of Greece or whoever the prince of the region are most likely the troops. And if you think of it in a normal military structure, like our military, under a general, you would have other commanders. You would have colonels. You would have majors. You would have captains. You'd have lieutenants. Then you might have enlisted troops like sergeants and corporals and privates. All of this structure of troops underneath the control of the general, underneath the ultimate commander of the troops. And so you can think of it looking like something like this. You have troops that are underneath troops. There's a structure of command. Now, I'm not saying that the military command is exactly what it looks like, but it would make sense if that's what it would look like. So when you are being attacked probably not by the prince, probably not by Satan himself, but one of the demons underneath the rule and the structure of Satan's commands. And we know that when Satan fell, that 1/3 of the angels fell with him, and this is what is called the demons, or the demonic presence in the world. Now, Paul alludes to this in Ephesians chapter 6 when he says that our battle is not against physical flesh and blood. Our battle, our real battle, is against against the powers, against the principalities of this present darkness. In other words, there is a spiritual warfare going on behind the scenes that we don't even see. The Bible alludes to these princes who can then control and manipulate the minds and the hearts of mankind. The Antichrist will be manipulated by Satan himself. Satan, who is overall structuring this, will at some point give his power to the Antichrist. It is not just demonic presence. Now you look and you read in the Bible when a person is possessed by a demon, and some of you have even had encounters where you've had fights with demonic entities, maybe a person being demon possessed. That's not what is happening with the Antichrist. Think of the power that a demon possessed person has. That's nothing compared to the power that the Antichrist will have, because Satan will give him all of his power, all of his rule, all of his authority at some point. So that's the structure of the spiritual warfare. Now we know that God has the same thing, because God, it alludes to here, he must have princes. We don't know how many. I don't know how many demons there are. I don't know how many princes there are. There's no way to know. Those are things beyond our understanding. But God has princes as well, because it refers to the battle that the prince of and he says to Daniel, the prince of your people, that would mean the prince of Israel, whose name is Michael, he rises up to fight against the prince of Persia. So what happens is you have this structure of the battle that is going on, and we know that God, though a third fell, that means two-thirds did not fall. So God has his own angelic beings who are messengers for him, who are doing his work, and one of them happens to be the Prince of Israel, Michael. So in the story of Daniel, Daniel is there, he is seeing a vision, and a prince comes, or an angel comes to him. We don't know what the angel's name is because it doesn't allude to it. We know that Gabriel came to him earlier. Gabriel also came to Mary and announced the birth of Jesus. But we don't know who this angel is. But the angel was detained by the prince of Persia until Michael stood up, and Michael came and fought for this angel who was basically detained. And in the battle, Michael fought for him, and the angel was then able to get through. Now, that invokes the question of, well, why was this happening? Why did this angel find this conflict? And I believe that's fully because Satan does not want the message of Daniel to get out. He wanted to stop it there before the message could actually come to Daniel himself, because once the message comes, then we will now know the game plan and what to look for in the coming of the Antichrist. And so we need this message. It's important that the message got through. It's important that the angel was able to get the message to Daniel. So for our understanding and for our sake, especially if we are the generation of those living in the end times events, we need to know this and without a doubt trust it, and without a doubt understand that it was given for a specific purpose. So for that reason, Satan did not want it to get through. He did not want this message given to the people today. Let's keep going with this. So, Daniel chapter 11 is where we now find ourselves. And in Daniel chapter 11, there's a couple of things that I want you to understand and know about. Really, from Daniel chapter 11, from verse 2 all the way through chapter 12, verse 13. That's the end of Daniel. Daniel chapter 11, or chapter 12, verse 13, that finishes up Daniel. Here's what we see. Now, we saw in chapter 10, picture of the spiritual battle that is going on. Chapter 11 is really the prophecy. It is the prophecy, the prophetic events that are going to happen. And here's what you find in chapter 11. You have verses 1 through 20, which are for you and I, they are the past. For Daniel, they were the future. So they were Daniel's future, but they're our past. And then you have for Daniel 21, really through the end of chapter 12, but really Daniel chapter 21 and on, you have what is our future as well. Now, liberal scholars, liberal theologians, in many ways, they are just atheistic theologians. I don't know why they even call themselves theologians, because they are not in any sense of the word theologians. They do not believe the Bible. They don't believe in any of the accuracy of the Bible. They want to disprove the Bible every way that they possibly can. So I don't know why you would call them anything other than atheists. They have fought against the book of Daniel for generations, for years and years. They have been fighting against the book of Daniel. In fact, many seminaries who are training up pastors today have also gotten on this bandwagon, and they are fighting against the book of Daniel. Why are they fighting against the book of Daniel? What is the problem that they have with the book of Daniel? Well, here's the problem that they have. One, or the main problem, is that they say the book of Daniel is too accurate. That's their complaint. It's too accurate. Well, what would that mean? Well, that would mean that for it to be so accurate, it could not have come from God, who could have been the source of this accuracy. It had to have been written well after the time of Daniel, well after the events are going to take place, in order to look back and see the accuracy that has happened. So many people have taken this stance, or many theologians, or many seminaries have now taken this stance that Daniel is not accurate. It was written well after, so Daniel is not the author. Well, here's the problem with that. is that Jesus believed Daniel was the author, and Jesus referred to the book of Daniel for our own understanding, and he encouraged people to go to the book of Daniel. So if Jesus believed Daniel to be true, and if we believe Jesus to be true, then we therefore have to believe Daniel to be true. The second reason is that not only did Jesus believe this, but Paul believed this as well. And Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, referred in many times in his writings to the book of Daniel. Paul wasn't the only one. Many of the disciples referred to the book of Daniel, believing the book of Daniel was true, because Jesus himself believed that the book of Daniel was true. So if we believe the book of Daniel to be true, then here's what you have. You have Daniel, who wrote this around 538 BC. That's the best guess. It's around 538 BC that Daniel wrote this. For Daniel, when he wrote this, these were all future events. In fact, these events would not start taking place for about 200 years into the future from the time that Daniel wrote it. Again, they are for Daniel the future. For us, we look back on it and we say, no, it's the past. And we can look at it and see that the events that are written in Daniel chapter 11 are the past, and they are absolutely accurate. And then there's a part of it that we look at and we say it's also the future. So this is where we would be right here. As Daniel wrote, he's right here. Everything is future for him. As we are sitting here, part of it's past, but most of it is the future. And so that's how we look at it. Now, why would this be important to us? Well, that's because if Daniel wrote this in 538 BC, like we believe he did, and if we take God to be serious and accurate, then God was giving prophecies that would be fulfilled starting 200 years later. If we look back and say, wow, those were fulfilled with incredible detail and incredible accuracy, that then means that we should believe the future events to be true as well. If the past was prophesied way back here and it was fulfilled right here, and if that was fulfilled with complete accuracy, then therefore this must be true. Why would Satan want to come against this? Because he is the ultimate deceiver and he stands against truth. He does not want any truth going out. He wants God's word to be discredited. He wants our idea and our understanding of both capital T truth, that's God's truth, and lowercase t truth, that's just the truth that all mankind believes. He wants that to be destroyed, that there is no truth. Because in Satan, there is no truth himself. He is the liar. He is the father of liars. He is the father and the creator of all lies. So he is attacking the truth. So we can look back and say Daniel was fulfilled. Therefore, if it was fulfilled with that kind of accuracy, then we can believe the accuracy going forward on the events that are yet to be fulfilled. So what are the events that have been fulfilled? Well, let's keep going and keep understanding this. So here's what we have. We have in Daniel chapter 11 verse 2, and let's just take note of this. I'm not going to read it all, but Daniel 11 verse 2, here's what we have. We have, again, Daniel's future, our past, dealing with the Persian Empire. And that's what's going to happen. Daniel chapter 11, verse 2, and he says, now I will declare a truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. Then a 4th will be far richer than all. When he becomes powerful through his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the realm of Greece. Now, this corresponds also with the previous prophecies that Daniel had been given in chapter 8. This is the vision of the ram in Daniel chapter 8. Then you have in Daniel chapter 11 verses 3 and 4. Again, this is Daniel's future. It's our past. It's related to the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire is going to correspond to, and this would have probably started taking place around 331 BC is when the Greek Empire would have been in full force. But this would have happened, and this is in Romans chapter, in chapter 8, this is the prophecy of the goat in chapter 8. So all of these things are overlapping. Again, this is Daniel's future, but our past. Then you have chapter 11, verses 5 through 20. Again, Daniel's future, our past, dealing with the events and the conflict between Egypt and Syria. These are going to be the conflicts that would happen between the king of the north and the king of the south. These two would come out of the goat. Remember the goat? Chapter 8, he had a big horn, it broke off, and 4 kingdoms came out of that. That would ultimately lead to the kingdoms of the north and the south. So, what were the kingdoms that came out of the one horn that broke off in Daniel chapter 8? If you remember these, here's what they were. You had the Cassander kingdom, Lysimachus kingdom. You had the Seleucid kingdom, and you had the kingdom of Ptolemy. And all of these had heirs, and all of these had, they had children, and they had, whatever problems and battles that they all had. But there are different regions that every one of these kingdoms covered. The kingdom of Cassander was mostly Macedonia. It was parts of Greece. You had the kingdom of Lysimachus, and that was the kingdoms of really a little bit north of Greece. It would have been Lydia, Ionia, a little bit of parts of present-day Turkey, a part of that. So the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemy dynasty are the two that are going to be the most important. The Seleucid dynasty would have been the area that is modern-day Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Afghanistan, into parts of Pakistan. The Seleucid dynasty would correspond with the king of the north. The Ptolemy dynasty would be the dynasties that would cover parts of Egypt and some of the neighboring regions. Parts of Egypt and some of the neighboring countries around Egypt, and south of Egypt would have been the Ptolemy dynasty. That would be the king of the south. And so, Daniel chapter 11, verses 5 through 20 are this constant conflict that happens between the king of the north and the king of the south. So chapter 11, verses 5 through 20, is a constant ongoing battle. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the history of it, but I can provide you the history if you're interested in that and you'd like to know more of the history about that. I can direct you there, but you can just look it up yourself as well, because it was fulfilled in incredible ways in Daniel 11, 5 through 20. And it's recorded in other historical writings about these battles that were going on. And what you see over and over again between Daniel 11, verses 5 through 20, is that you're going to see, in fact, it picks it up really in verses 3 and 4 about the mighty king arising. That's Alexander. And his kingdom will be broken into 4 and scattered to the 4 winds of heaven. That's the 4 kingdoms that are there. And then verses 5 through 20 is this ongoing conflict of the king of the north coming against the king of the south. So the king of the north would attack the king of the south would attack the north, and they were constantly in turmoil against one another. Now, why would this matter, or why would this be important? And that's because right here in the middle of all of this that's going on, you have the nation of Israel. Israel was the crossroads of the battleground between the king of the north and the king of the south, and they were constantly vying for who could be in control and power over Israel, because you would have direct access to not only docking all of your ships, but you would be able to march armies through toward your enemy. And that was going on from 5 through 20 continuously. They had a little bit of time of peace in there. As it says in verse 13, there was an interval of some years and they had some peace, but mostly they were always in conflict with each other. Then one king would rise up, the king of the north would rise up. The king of the north in verse 15 built a siege ramp, captured a well-fortified city. The forces of the south will not prevail. Not even their select troops will have strength to prevail, but the invader will do as he pleases. Nobody's going to be able to stand against this king of the north. He will come and he will take hold of the glorious land. He will take hold of Israel itself. He will hold on to this. Finally, in verse 20, in his place one will arise who will dispatch a tax collector to exact tribute for royal glory, but within a few days he will be destroyed, though not in anger or battle. So there was this constant conflict of the heirs Seleucid dynasty and the heirs of the Ptolemy dynasty. So they were constantly fighting, going back and forth. Again, these were all future events for Daniel. They're past events for us. Go look at some of the history and you could see, wow, the Bible was incredibly accurate in what it predicted because these kings came to pass. Now, let's pick it up in verse 21, and this is where we're going to start digging in. And I would encourage you, if you have a Bible, to follow along in your Bible. I've got some scripture on the screen, but not a lot of scripture. I want you to be able to follow along with some of the things that I'm going to talk about here for yourself. And I'm going to pick it up in before we even get into 21 to start giving you a little bit of history about the picture of what the Antichrist will be. So here's what we have. We're going to pick it up again in verse 21 in just a second. The king of the north, there would ultimately come a king. He would be an heir of the Seleucid dynasty, and his name would be Antiochus. And you've probably heard this name, but Antiochus Epiphanes. But he would not be the first, second, or third. This would be Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth was going to ultimately come on the scene, and verse 21 is a picture that could potentially be Antiochus Epiphanes, but it's not completely the picture. It's not completely accurate in the person of Antiochus Epiphanes. So what Antiochus Epiphanes becomes is he becomes what is called a type or a shadow of the Antichrist who would come. So if you want to understand exactly what the Antichrist will be like, look at the person of Antiochus Epiphanes and look at what Daniel chapter 11 says, because Antiochus Epiphanes is going to become the type and shadow of the Antichrist. In the last days, the Antichrist will bring a campaign of terror against Israel, similar to what Antiochus Epiphanes did in his day, but the Antichrist will be with much more veracity, much more pain, much more suffering, and much more power. So Antiochus Epiphanes is a type or a mirror or a shadow of what the Antichrist will do in the days that will come. So in chapter 11, verse 21, it's a reference to Antiochus Epiphanes, but more so as a type of what the Antichrist will ultimately be. Like so many of the Old Testament prophecies, the prophecies of Daniel 11 many times are dualistic in nature, meaning that the prophetic descriptions have both a historical fulfillment and they have a future fulfillment. Many times they're layered in such a way that it can apply to two at the same time. It can apply to Antiochus Epiphanes, but it also applies more so to the Antichrist and the time of the end. So again, Antiochus provides the most comprehensive profile of the Antichrist so that we can learn a great deal about the future by studying not only this passage, but studying a little bit of history about this king. So, who is Antiochus Epiphanes? He is the king of the north. So, the king of the north, he is the king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. And Daniel's prophecy of the king of the north really culminates in Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, if you think about what was going on in that day, the North and the South were always battling. They were always going against each other. Now I want you to think about the current state of the Middle East. The Middle East is always battling. They're always battling someone. Factions and groups and proxies are always fighting. There is never peace in the Middle East. There has never been peace in the Middle East. There will never be peace in the Middle East. It is an impossibility, and it will not happen. They are always at war in the same way that the king of the north and the king of the south were always at war. Antiochus Epiphanes was at war with the Ptolemy dynasty of Egypt. And they wanted to come against them and destroy them and take hold of their kingdom. So both Daniel and John speak of the Antichrist and his rising to to power in the same way that Antiochus Epiphanes rose to power and came against his enemy, which would have been Ptolemy, the Ptolemy kingdom, the king of the south. So what are some of the things that we need to learn about Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, first of all, about Antiochus Epiphanes, I want you to learn this, that Antiochus Epiphanes he was a usurper of power. So that's one note you can make about Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a usurper of power. Now, how do we get the information about Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, there's an interesting extra-biblical writing called First Maccabees. Now, First Maccabees is considered an apocryphal book, meaning that they don't take it as fully scripture, but First Maccabees gives a lot of detail about the history. You don't have to take it as theology. You don't have to take it as God inspired, but you can understand it as more of a historical document of that day. In First Maccabees, it describes this person by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, and it describes him as being a hostage in Rome before he rose to power in the Syrian area. Now, the prophecy of Daniel implies that the Antichrist will have to usurp or take his power, that the Antichrist will be a master manipulator, making political power plays with flattery and lies. This corresponds to Daniel's description of the Antichrist as the little horn. If you remember back in Daniel chapter 7, the little horn speaks boastfully. He speaks blasphemy. He's nothing. He rises to power and he takes hold of power just the same way that Antiochus Epiphanes took hold of power. Just like Satan himself, the Antichrist will be a usurper of power, stealing that which doesn't belong to him. So he's a usurper of power. Now, the Antichrist also is a maker, and this is important. He is a maker and breaker of the covenant. You say, well, what does that mean? I'm not sure what that means. Well, Daniel's prophecies involve the confirmation of some type of covenant, some kind of peace agreement or peace accord that is made between the people of Israel and another nation or group of nations. Now, many have speculated about the interpretation of this covenant, especially concerning what role the Antichrist will play in it. Now, some believe that this covenant that is going to happen, perhaps, like I said, it's a peace agreement maybe, it's going to be made between the Antichrist and Israel. Others see the Antichrist as one who initiates and confirms the covenant between Israel and maybe another party. Maybe the Antichrist is a middleman. I don't know. Perhaps the peace accord will involve some international approval that has to take place. International approval that has to take place before the temple, the third temple, is rebuilt. Either way, there will be a future covenant with Israel that will play a critical role in the last days. Now, in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, it says this. It says that, and this is in Daniel's 70 weeks, it says that the Antichrist will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will break the covenant. He will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of abomination will come one who destroys until the decreed annihilation. So the Antichrist will make a covenant with Israel, a peace agreement, some kind of an accord, and then in the middle of it, he will break the agreement and he will enforce his rule upon Israel. Interestingly, that is exactly what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes made a covenant and an agreement with Israel, and he broke the agreement. He was a maker and he was a breaker. It's not a very good E. Let me draw that E there. He was a maker and a breaker of the covenant. How do we know that? This is in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 29 through 32. Now again, don't look at it as divinely inspired, but look at 1 Maccabees as a historical document. Now, 1 Maccabees covers the life of the Maccabees in particular Judas Maccabee, who rose up and fought against Antiochus Epiphanes and took back the temple from them. And they had the celebration of Hanukkah that happened as a result of the Maccabean revolt. But that's a side note for a different time. In 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 29, it tells what Antiochus Epiphanes did, which is exactly what the Antichrist will do at the end. Look what it says. The wicked ruler, this is in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, and it says this. It says that the wicked ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, the third of Syria, was a descendant of one of Alexander's generals. Antiochus Epiphanes had been a hostage in Rome before he became king of Syria in the year 175 BC. It goes on to say this. Daniel says he will make a covenant, a firm covenant, and he will break it in the middle of the week. 1 Maccabees 1, 29 through 32. 2 years later, Antiochus sent a large army from Mysia against the towns of Judea. When the soldiers entered Jerusalem, their commander spoke to the people, offering them terms of peace and completely deceiving them. So notice those words. He came in, he offered them terms of peace, and he completely deceived them. Well, that's exactly what it says that the Antichrist will do. He will make a covenant. He will make a peace agreement. He will barter some treaty, some agreement. He will make a covenant, but he will be deceiving them in the making of that covenant. Because halfway through the covenant, he will break the covenant. That's Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Offering them terms of peace. This is what Maccabees says. Antiochus Epiphanes' soldiers offered them terms of peace and completely deceived them. Then he suddenly launched a fierce attack on the city, dealing it a major blow and killing many of the people. He plundered the city, set it on fire, and tore down its buildings and walls. He and his army took the women and children as prisoners and seized the cattle. That's what Antiochus Epiphanes did. That's what the Antichrist will do. So the Antiochus Epiphanes was a usurper of power, so will the Antichrist be. He was a maker and breaker of covenants, so will the Antichrist be. And then he also completed what was called the Abomination of Desolation, which is what the Antichrist will do. In the same manner as Antiochus Epiphanes, the Antichrist will use this covenant to get just what he wants, and then once he has gotten what he wants, he will ruthlessly turn on all of the parties involved. Just as there was a temple in Jerusalem in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, there will be a temple in the last days. So there has to be a temple rebuilt for all of the last time events or the end time events to take place. So be on the lookout and be on the watch. Keep your ear tuned into the news in Israel for when they start breaking ground for the temple. You can know that we are getting close. We are on the knife's edge of the end times events taking place. So just as there was a temple at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, there will be a temple at the time of the Antichrist. And so what happened was, once the covenant was in place, Antiochus Epiphanes broke the covenant, turned on all the parties involved. He came against the temple. Now, this is what Jesus warned about. Jesus said that everyone living in or around Jerusalem in the last days of the Antichrist is to flee the city when they see what was called the, quote, Abomination of Desolation that Jesus says was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, when you see him standing or doing this, standing in the holy place. So what was the great abomination of desolation that took place? Well, again, this is what will happen at the time of the Antichrist, but it was also already foreshadowed in Antiochus Epiphanes. Here's what he did. He did away with the Jewish sacrifices in the holy place. For the Antichrist to put an end to the sacrifices in the last days means that the Jewish sacrificial system will be reestablished and the altar of the Lord will be rebuilt. Again, that's going to be the third temple complex that will happen. And Antiochus Epiphanes did it then. He will do it again in the future. The Antichrist will. Look at what 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 45 through 47 and verse 50 says about what Antiochus Epiphanes did. And again, we can get this as the picture of what the Antichrist is going to do. So here's what he said. Antiochus Epiphanes, he ordered them not to offer burnt offerings, grain offerings, or wine offerings in the temple. So no more sacrificial system, no more temple system, no more temple offerings, no more burnt offerings, no more grain offerings, no more wine offerings in the temple. And Antiochus Epiphanes commanded them to treat Sabbaths, remember that's the day of rest, and festivals, which are also days of rest. You treat them as ordinary work days. There's no more times. He has changed the laws and the times. Remember, it said that earlier in the book of Daniel. He will change the laws. He will change the times. He will change the ordinances. So we follow the Sabbath. We follow the festivals. We can't do that anymore. He has put an end to that. That's what Antiochus Epiphanes did. It's what the Antichrist will do. Look what it says. They were even ordered to defile the temple and the holy things in it. They were commanded to build pagan altars, temples, and shrines, and to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals there. The penalty toward the Jewish people for disobeying what King Antiochus Epiphanes said was death. So you either do what we say, or you will die. So after putting an end to the Jewish sacrificial system, the Antichrist will totally defile and profane the altar and the temple with some sort of pagan blood sacrifice and occult ritual, perhaps. He will bring in foreign gods, false gods, into the temple, and he will worship his gods and command everybody else to worship his gods while he has control of the temple. The Antichrist will then take his seat on the throne of what is symbolically the earthly throne of the Lord, and he will mock God while magnifying himself before the Lord. Now, Paul writes about this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Paul says this, "Let no one deceive you in any way. For the day," that's the great day of the Lord, it's the day that Daniel is talking about, "the day will not come of God's return until and unless the rebellion comes first, the man of lawlessness," that's the Antichrist, is revealed, the one who is destined to be destroyed. The Antichrist opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that the Antichrist sits in the temple of God, proclaiming himself that he is God. So this is exactly what happened with that Daniel was prophesying about. This is exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did, and Antiochus Epiphanes is a type and a shadow of the Antichrist that would come, and all of this is important to understand as we go through the next part of Daniel. You're going to see all of this starting to play out as we look at it. Now, again, remember that the prophecies of Daniel are both of Antiochus Epiphanes as a type and of the Antichrist as the ultimate fulfillment. Antiochus Epiphanes does not fulfill it all perfectly. He fills it in part. The Antichrist will fulfill it completely. But the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did are the things that the Antichrist will also do. And Paul warns about it, that he will put himself in the temple. He will do an abominable act. That's the abomination of desolation. He will make a covenant with Israel, and he will break the covenant the way Antiochus Epiphanes did. He will turn against the people. He will take over the temple. He will do away with the sacrificial system, and he will institute his own laws, his own ordinances, and his own plans, and the people of God will be commanded to obey him, or they will die, the way that it happened in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. One more part of this. It's also worth comparing the prophecy of Daniel with the other historical accounts that happened. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes erected an altar to Zeus in the Jewish temple, and he defiled the holy place with the pagan blood sacrifice. Now, this is what Maccabees records, and this is why I bring this up. Here's what he says. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 167 BC, so he's given a completely accurate date of when this is going to happen, or this is giving the accurate date of when it did happen. King Antiochus set up the awful horror on the altar of the temple, and the pagan altars were built in the towns throughout Judea. Pagan sacrifices were offered in front of the houses and in the streets. On the 25th day of the month, these same evil people offered sacrifices on the pagan altar erected on top of the altar in the temple. Mothers who had allowed their babies to be circumcised, in other words, Orthodox Jewish mothers who followed the commands of Torah, were put to death in accordance with the king's decree. Their babies were hung around their necks, and their families and those who had circumcised them were put to death. Everyone who did not bow down to Antiochus Epiphanes, and everyone who will not bow down to the coming Antichrist, especially the Orthodox Jewish people, will suffer the consequences. Now, lastly, one of the things that would happen for the Antichrist, and it's going to say this in Daniel chapter 11, is that when the Antichrist returns, that he will divide the nation of Israel as if it were his to give away. He shall deal with the nation, and it says in Daniel chapter 11:39 that he will divide up his land. And we already see this how this could possibly play out, as the land will be divided and given to the Palestinian people, because that's what the Antichrist will do. It will be ruthless. As bad as Antiochus Epiphanes was, and as horrible as the things that he did to the temple and to the people of God, the coming Antichrist, what Antiochus Epiphanes did, is nothing compared to what the coming Antichrist will do. All of these pieces of the prophetic puzzle have to be taken into account as we look at what will happen in the days that will come. So, with that said, we are now at chapter 11, verse 21. You have the background of Antiochus Epiphanes. You understand how he was a type and a shadow of the coming Antichrist. You understand that the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did were really the same things that the Antichrist will do, although the Antichrist will do it many factors beyond what Antiochus Epiphanes did. And so as we read the rest of Daniel chapter 11 and Daniel chapter 12, keep in the back of your mind the story and the understanding of Antiochus Epiphanes, and you will understand how the Antichrist is going to act and what the Antichrist is going to do. Here's what we know so far. The Antichrist will come against the nation of Israel with a great kingdom and a great power and with great veracity. But as he comes against the land, he will create a covenant with the land. He will create a covenant and an agreement, but he will break that covenant and agreement at least 3.5 years into the agreement that has been made. At some point, he will break that covenant, and he will turn upon the people that he has made this agreement with. He will come into the temple that will have been rebuilt, the sacrificial system that will have been restored. He will come into that temple, and he will do away with the sacrificial system. He will do away with the Sabbath. He will do away with the festivals. He will reinstitute his plans and his rule and his ordinances and his laws. He will defile the temple by sacrificing unholy things in that temple, declaring himself to be God, sitting upon what would be known as the throne of God, declaring himself to be God, and he will demand that his God be worshipped in the place of the one true God. That's what will happen with the Antichrist, and we will understand this more as we go through the rest of 11 and 12. Well, we're going to stop right there because we're already 1 hour into this study and I am out of time. So what we're going to do next time is pick it up from there. But I want to give you an outline of the things that will come. So here's what we'll see in the final tribulation. There's going to be three different events that we are going to look at in chapter 11, verses 21 through 30. We're going to see before the tribulation. What will happen leading up to the tribulation events? What are the things that are going to take place before the tribulation happens? The rise of the Antichrist before the tribulation. Then we're going to see in chapter 11, verses 31 through 45, the events that will happen during the tribulation. And then in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we will see the events that happen after the tribulation, the end of the tribulation, the resurrection of the dead that will take place at the end of it. And then we will have some final details that will come about. The details about the tribulation that will be found in verses 4 through 13 of chapter 12. We're going to see the command to seal the vision. We're going to see the length and the severity of the tribulation. We're going to see the sealed purpose of the tribulation, the transitional days after the tribulation, and one final message, the encouragement to Daniel. Now, we're going to get through probably half of that next week, the final half the following week, and then we are going to turn to the book of Revelation and begin to tie the pieces of Revelation together with the book of Daniel, with everything that Jesus taught in Matthew 24 and 25. So that's all I have today, and I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope that you were able to understand it, and if you didn't, make sure you go through it again and try to get an understanding so that you can be engaged as we go through the next part of this in our next study. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you giving me so much time, so much of your time to be able to study God's Word together. And next week, we will pick it up right there in Daniel chapter 12, or Daniel chapter 11, verse 21, where we will look at the events that happened before the tribulation. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. God bless you, and may God protect you.